The first rule of America's hidden dynasties is this: if you've heard their names, you've heard a lie. The truth about them is buried so deep that even their enemies choke on the dirt before reaching it. And yet, if you stand still in the right places, at the right hour, the land itself will whisper their real names to you, not in words, but in the way shadows move where no wind stirs. I am going to tell you about one of them now. But know this: once you hear it, you can't. Return to the man you were before, because blood remembers. And cursed blood remembers longer. Our story begins not in a grand hall or a gilded mansion, but in a graveyard that no one admits exists. You won't find it on any map, though it's older than the first 13 colonies. It lies where Virginia's forests knot so thick the sun can't break through, and where the moss grows over the stones like the earth is trying to smother the names carved there. On one of those stones, barely legible beneath centuries of rot, is a crest, half serpent, half blade. No surname, just that mark. The men who tended this land once called themselves the Lorwicks, farmers to the public. A necessary lie. In truth, they were the architects of a debt so deep it didn't end when a man died. Their fortune wasn't built on tobacco or trade, but on a far older economy, flesh and fear. And what I'm telling you now, no history book will confirm. The year was 1792, and the Lorwicks had already mastered the art of vanishing from official records. The census taker sent to count their holdings was found dead 3 days later, floating face up in a creek with his eyes missing, the ink from his ledger smeared into something unreadable. But the ledger didn't vanish. It was quietly locked away in a private collection, and in it, beneath the lists of fictional farmhands, was a single entry that should not exist. 200 souls, unnamed, below. Below what? Below the earth? Below the house? Or below something even older than either? Those who tried to ask didn't get the chance to repeat the question. You need to understand something. This family didn't just hoard wealth, they hoarded lineage. They bred it, cultivated it. They took orphans from the frontier not to raise them, but to test them, marrying them into the bloodline if they bore the sign, and discarding them if they didn't. No one outside the inner circle could agree on what the sign was, only that children chosen by the Lorwicks never cried. Not once, even as infants. In a century where most men clung to the church for fear of hell, the Lorwicks clung to something far darker, something they called the root. It wasn't a metaphor. The elders of surrounding towns told stories of an oak deep in the Lorwick woods, its bark black as coal, its roots so vast they buckled the ground in waves like the spine of some buried giant. They said the family would gather there at night carrying their dead in silence, feeding the root so the root would feed them in return. And the root always gave back. Their crops never failed, their barns never burned, their coffers never emptied. But the price, it was always taken in blood. You'd think a family like this would have been hunted down, exposed, driven into the ground. And yet they were untouchable. Because they knew something the rest of the colonies refused to admit. America wasn't built on freedom. It was built on contracts. And the oldest contracts aren't written on paper. They're written in what you spill when the blade slips. By the winter of 1799, the Lorwicks had quietly spread their reach through marriages of convenience and debts that could never be repaid. One branch of the family controlled a shipping company that never seemed to lose a vessel. Another ran a bank that never closed its doors, even during panics. But their power wasn't in the ships or the gold. It was in the people bound to them. Entire generations owed their lives, their land, their children to this family, and those debts followed them into the ground. Now, here's where the records get strange. In February of that year, during one of the coldest freezes on record, a rider appeared in the nearest town with a single piece of paper nailed to the door of the courthouse. The message was short. It is awake. No signature, no seal, just those 3 words. That night, the sound began. A deep, rhythmic pulse from the direction of the Lorwick land, like the heartbeat of something too large to be human. Witnesses swore the ground shook in time with it. Animals fled into the woods and didn't return. The next morning, every window in the Lorwick estate was found shattered from the inside. No bodies, no tracks in the snow, just silence, and the black oak in the distance, its branches bent toward the house as if it had leaned closer during the night. For months, the estate stood empty. Men went in to loot and never came out. Finally, the governor ordered the house burned. It went up quickly, but the fire burned cold, smoke without heat. When the ash settled, the black oak was gone, vanished. And yet people in the neighboring counties began to see it, always on the far horizon, always where it shouldn't be, as if the tree had learned to walk. You're probably wondering, what does this have to do with the America you know? Everything. Because the Lorwicks didn't vanish. They moved, changed names, wove themselves into new bloodlines, hiding in plain sight. You've met their descendants, without knowing it. Some run companies, some run towns, some run families you think of as your own. And the root they served? It's still being fed, not in the woods anymore. Now it's fed in boardrooms, in hospitals, in places where no one notices the contracts being signed in something thicker than ink. So listen carefully. Before we go further down this road, you need to decide whether you really want to know what they became. Because once you see the root for what it is, you'll realize it's not just their family tree. It's America's. And its branches are already above your head. The thing about blood curses is that they do not always appear as lightning strikes from the heavens or plagues descending overnight. More often they seep, slow and patient, into the cracks of daily life until every breath a man takes carries a taste of it. The Lorwicks understood this better than anyone because they were not just cursed. They were the curse, a lineage engineered not merely to survive, but to spread its infection into whatever soil it touched. In the spring of 1803, a man named Ezra Carrington took a surveying contract in the southern reaches of Virginia and, against the advice of his peers, set his base camp on a parcel of land recently abandoned by what the locals whispered was an unfortunate branch of the Lorwick family. Ezra was a man of figures and boundaries, one who believed that every problem could be measured, drawn, and contained. He arrived with his compasses and chains, his ledgers and ink, determined to tame the land, with neat lines and right angles, as if geometry could stand against whatever had driven the last owners away. For the first 3 days, his reports were perfectly ordinary. Notes on soil composition, measurements of clearings, even a sketch of a small spring that bubbled at the edge of the property. But on the 4th day, the tone shifted. In the margin of his survey, he wrote one sentence in a cramped, uneven hand. "The tree has no shadow." His handwriting deteriorated over the next pages, lines wavering as if written on a moving surface, though no wind was recorded and his camp was well sheltered. By day 7, there were no more measurements, only fragmented observations, roots above ground in shapes like knotted fists, a low hum that seemed to come from inside his own skull, and a growing certainty that something beneath him was not sleeping but listening. When Ezra failed to return to town, a small party was sent to retrieve him. They found his camp abandoned, instruments neatly packed, bedroll undisturbed, but his ledgers were stacked in a perfect tower on the center of. The clearing and each page had been blackened with ink until no words remained. In the middle of the topmost page, pressed deep into the paper, was a circular impression as though something heavy had rested there for hours. Not long after, 2 of the search party took sick, complaining of voices in their teeth and the sensation of roots threading beneath their skin. They did not recover. The Lorwicks never came back for that land, but the deed remained in their name, untaxed and unclaimed, as if even the state dared not touch it. What you must understand is that these incidents were never isolated. They were proofs, reminders that the root's reach was not bound to a single tree or a single property. It could migrate, finding new vessels in soil, in flesh, in the hidden places of men's minds. And those who carried the bloodline acted as its keepers, its gardeners, pruning and grafting lives with the same cold precision a butcher uses to dress meat. By the early 1820s, the Lorwick name was a ghost in official records, but alive in rumor. Farmers spoke of children born with dark lines branching beneath their skin, lines that pulsed faintly when touched. Merchants in Richmond whispered of a man who paid for a warehouse in gold coins that had no mint mark and seemed to rust instead of tarnish. Sailors told of cargoes bound for foreign ports that were never seen again, though the ships themselves returned empty, their timbers damp with brackish water no one could identify. In all these stories, there was a common thread. Someone in the chain of events had a connection to a quiet family whose home no one could quite place. It was during this time that an ex-preacher named Silas Breen began collecting testimonies from anyone who had crossed paths with these descendants. He called it his Ledger of the Root, a book bound in rough hide that he carried everywhere and never let out of his sight. Silas claimed he had once been invited to a Lorwick gathering disguised as a harvest feast, only to find that the tables were set not with food, but with objects wrapped in white cloth, each the size of a human head. He never saw what lay beneath, but he heard breathing coming from the cloth and a sound like soil falling onto wood. He left before the unwrapping began, but in his dreams afterward he saw those shapes unbound, their faces familiar, but their eyes filled with soil. Silas lived another 12 years, traveling from town to town, warning anyone who would listen that the root was not just a tree or a curse, but a system, a living network of blood and obligation that thrived on secrecy and obedience. He was found dead in a roadside chapel, his ledger missing, the inside of his mouth packed with black earth. No one claimed his body. What makes this dangerous for you listening now is the pattern. The Lorwicks were not the only ones. America's early dynasties, those whose wealth seemed to regenerate no matter how many wars or collapses came, shared threads that lead back to the same soil, the same black-rooted hunger. Some of them learned to disguise it in charity, in politics, in the soft language of progress. But the mechanics were the same. Take, bind, feed, grow. If you have ever felt that decisions about your life were being made in rooms you could not enter, you have brushed against one of their branches. If you have ever seen a man rise to power despite every failure, watched him flourish while better men were broken, you have seen the root at work. And the Lorwick bloodline, more than any other, was the gardener's hand that shaped it. By 1835, their influence reached as far west as the Mississippi, though their name was never spoken aloud. Travelers crossing through certain counties reported strange detours, roads that bent away from their destinations, only to deposit them at gates they did not intend to find. Some spoke of figures watching from the edge of the woods, their faces obscured but their hands unmistakably marked with deep, bark-like ridges. And there were always children in these stories, standing too still, eyes fixed on nothing, as if waiting for an unseen signal. Those who tried to take these children away found themselves sick within days, their skin mottling, their thoughts slowing, until they either returned the child or wasted away entirely. The blood was territorial. It protected its own. In the winter of that year, a riverboat captain named Hollis Crane took on a passenger list that included a quiet woman and 2 silent boys. The woman paid double fare in advance, insisted her cabin. Daughter remained locked from the outside, and told the captain only one thing: "Do not stop for the tree." Crane laughed, thinking it a superstition. But 2 nights into the journey, the boat drifted into a fog so thick the crew could barely see their own hands. When it cleared, a massive black tree stood half submerged in the river ahead. its branches, arched over the deck like fingers reaching to pull the vessel in. The woman began to scream. Not words, but a low, keening wail that made the crew's teeth ache. Crane ordered full steam, steering wide, but as they passed, he saw faces in the bark, mouths open in silent cries. By morning, the woman and the boys were gone, her locked door hanging open, the sheets covered in soil. Crane sold the boat within the month and never spoke of it again. Every account, every fragment paints the same picture. This was not a family cursed by accident. This was a design, old and deliberate, feeding on generations, hiding in marriages and adoptions, wearing the skin of respectability, while its roots dug deeper into the foundation of the nation itself. And if you think this is only history, you are already in danger. Because the kind of power they wielded does not vanish. It adapts. It changes form. The contracts they wrote in blood are still being honored, though now the ink is digital and the paper is screens. The root still has gardeners, and they still tend the branches with precision, deciding which lives flourish and which are pruned. If you feel the pull to keep listening, it's because on some level you know you've already stepped onto their soil, and once you stand there, you belong to the story. The blood that runs through certain American veins is not the same blood that runs through yours and mine, and those who belong to no dynasty at all. It is older, darker, more deliberate. It has been distilled over centuries like a venom refined in the shadow of palaces across the ocean before being smuggled across the Atlantic under the guise of commerce and progress. These families did not merely arrive here. They embedded themselves into the roots of the land, grafting their legacy into the soil so deeply that to pull them out would mean ripping apart the very map of the nation itself. You think power in America is decided by votes, by markets, by merit, but power in America is an heirloom passed from father to son, from widow to son-in-law, from bastard child to the silent benefactor who knows how to use them. These are the houses that write the histories you were taught in school, that sit upon the committees deciding which truths are archived and which are quietly burned. The ones who call the law not to obey it, but to write it. The curse they carry is not metaphor alone. It is a living thread in their lineage, binding them to acts they cannot avoid, murders, they cannot undo debts, they cannot repay to forces older than the Republic itself. Every generation inherits the pact without consent, because the pact is sealed in the bloodline, not the will. You can see the signs if you know where to look. A sudden death, just as an investigation closes a fire consuming. Only the one warehouse that held the incriminating ledger, a scandal hushed by the resignation of the wrong man. They will tell you coincidence rules the world, because that keeps you from noticing their fingerprints on every disaster in which they profit. Their curse is not that they are doomed to lose, but that they are doomed to win at costs that would shatter the soul of an ordinary man. The founding of these dynasties was never about land or wealth alone. It was about leverage, and leverage, in its purest form, is always tied to someone else's ruin. The first of them to cross into the colonies came not as hopeful settlers, but as collectors of old debts owed by kings to merchants, by lords to spies, by war councils to those who provided the weapons. They came carrying invisible ledgers and invisible chains, seeking not the new world's promise, but the perfect stage for an old game. And here in America, they found a nation young enough to be molded, but naive enough to think. It was born free, the soil was fresh, but the roots they planted were imported. Every generation of these dynasties has had its marked child, the one who feels the curse before the rest, the one who sees things in dreams before they happen, the one who hears voices not in madness but in memory. The family always knows which child it is, though they never speak it aloud. It shows in the way the elders watch them, the way their freedoms are both expanded and confined. The marked child is given more and taken more, because the curse must always have its vessel. The vessel changes form, but the current is always the same. You can trace the events back if you dare, a carriage accident that left the patriarch's only rival dead in the road, though the horses were seen to stop themselves seconds before the impact. A contract for a land purchase that was signed weeks before its previous owner died unexpectedly in his sleep with no symptoms. The marked child is always somewhere near, the moment the dynasty moves forward by unnatural means, and though the newspapers call it luck or providence, the truth is less poetic. It is ritual sustained not in stone circles under the moon, but in boardrooms and parlors in the hours just before. Dawn when the servants have been sent away, and the whiskey is poured not for drinking but for summoning the family curse, feeds on silence on the unspoken agreement that what must be done will be done without question, that the child will be groomed. Not in the arts of kindness or intellect, but in the precise calculus of how much suffering must be inflicted to gain one more step of ground. The marked child grows up learning to read not books, but faces, learning to speak, not truths, but the words that will lead someone exactly where they need them to go. The curse is survival at any cost, and the cost is always paid by someone else. These dynasties do not age in the way you or I understand. They are measured not in years, but in epochs, in crises they weathered and crises they created. Some have seen the fall of empires, the rise of nations, wars that erased millions, and treaties that enslaved entire peoples without ever having their names printed on the first page of history. Their curse ensures they will never die in obscurity, but also never live in peace. Their portraits hang in the oldest rooms of the oldest houses, yet each face carries the same eyes, the same impossible recognition that they were here before, and will be here again. The marked child of each generation inherits those eyes, and though they may try to run, they never make it far. The world bends back toward them, drawing them to the seat of the family's will. And when they take that seat, whether at 25 or 50, they find the ledger waiting, as it always has with their name already written in it. The ink is never dry because the curse is never dormant. It whispers in their own voice. It reminds them of debts owed to names no longer. Spoken above a whisper, it tells them the family has survived worse and will survive again as long as they do what must be done. And what must be done is rarely clean, rarely lawful, rarely forgivable. Yet it is always necessary in the language of the dynasty. Necessity is the only virtue, loyalty, the only law and blood, the only currency outsiders will never truly see the curse, because they mistake it for ambition or cruelty or luck. But those within the dynasty know better. They know that every deal struck is a thread in the web, and every broken promise is a signal to the thing at the center of it that the family is failing, and the thing at the center does not forgive failure. The marked child learns that lesson first, always in a way designed to break them. A friend lost a love, destroyed a life traded for the family's gain. They break so that the dynasty can remain whole. The curse demands it. The curse feeds on it, and the curse ensures it will be remembered long after the child is gone. The faces in the portraits may change, the names in the ledgers may be altered, but the blood remains the same, and the blood remembers every bargain, every betrayal, every life taken in its name. The families call it legacy, the outsiders call it power, but it is neither. It is servitude to a pact so old. No one remembers who offered it first, only that it cannot be undone, only that it must be obeyed. The whispers grew louder as the century turned, though no one dared admit they heard them. Not in the towns where the family's influence pressed down like a suffocating fog. Their name was never written in newspapers, never etched into public records, yet their reach could be felt in every courthouse verdict, every sudden shift in property lines, every unexplained fire that conveniently erased the past. Those who spoke of them did so in taverns with eyes darting to the corners, voices barely louder than breath. They were said to trace their blood to the first ships that slipped into the harbors, before the colonies even had a name, carrying with them contracts not signed in ink but in blood, bargains whispered to powers that did not dwell in the light. Their estate, hidden behind forests older than the maps, was a place of no fixed address. Travelers claimed that the road to it was never the same twice, that one might walk for hours and find nothing but trees, yet return the next day and discover a wrought iron gate staring back like an unblinking sentinel. The main house, when it appeared, was a cathedral of shadow, its windows reflecting no sunlight, its chimneys exhaling smoke even when no fire was lit. Inside, time seemed to slow, and the air carried a metallic taste that clung to the tongue, long after one left. There were rooms with locked doors where no keys existed, and halls that were shorter or longer depending on who walked them. The family themselves were ageless in a way that defied natural law. Portraits painted centuries apart showed the same eyes, the same jawline, the same faint scar at the temple, though the names beneath the frames changed. They hosted gatherings to which no outsider was truly invited, men of influence, women whose fortunes could sway entire regions, clergy who blessed and cursed with equal fervor. The meetings ended before dawn, and those who attended returned to their lives altered in ways they couldn't name. A merchant might suddenly abandon his trade and vanish. A magistrate might reverse a ruling that had seemed immovable. The family's fortune was tied not to gold nor to land, but to something older, something they called the inheritance of will. It was said that once a century they performed a rite in the depths of the estate, one that required no witnesses and tolerated no interruption. The few who claimed to have glimpsed it spoke of a stone altar that bled when the moon was right, of voices that came from the walls, not the mouths of men. These tales were dismissed as madness, until one winter when a hunter went missing in the woods and was found weeks later at the estate's gate, barefoot and shivering, clutching a carved wooden figure that looked suspiciously like a member of the family. His eyes were milky white, and his tongue had been removed cleanly at the root. Even then, no accusations were made. Fear had a way of ensuring silence where the law could not. Generations passed, and the outside world began to change. Machines. In the cities, wars that redrew borders. But within the family's territory, nothing shifted without their consent. Crops failed in neighboring counties but thrived on their lands. Epidemics skirted their villages like rivers diverting around. Stone. Yet there was a cost, one that locals felt even if they could not name it. The children born near the estate were not always born right. Some came into the world with teeth already formed, others with skin that bruised at a touch but healed within minutes. A few, the unlucky few, never cried, their eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Midwives whispered of an unseen presence in the birthing rooms, a coldness that lingered for hours after delivery. These children were quietly taken, their fates unknown, their names stricken from church records. Parents were told they had died, and in a way, perhaps they had. The dynasty's reach extended into these tragedies like roots into soil, unseen, but inescapable. Outsiders who bought land near the estate found themselves ruined within a year. Cattle sickened, wells turned foul, barns burned under skies clear of lightning. The land always returned to the family, as though it had been waiting for their claim. In the rare moments when an outsider stood up to them, the end was swift and merciless. One summer, a lawyer from the city arrived, determined to uncover the truth about a disputed inheritance tied to the estate. He spent weeks combing through archives, interviewing locals, drawing maps of the property's boundaries. Then one morning he was found face down in the river, his pockets filled with stones, from the estate's garden. The coroner called it suicide. Those who knew better simply shook their heads and never spoke his name again. Beneath all of it ran the unshakable sense that the family's blood was not like other blood. Some said they were marked from birth, veins carrying not just life, but an oath made before the country was born. Others whispered that their ancestors had been human once, but had traded pieces of their humanity for dominion over this place, and that the bargain renewed itself with each generation. The truth, if it could be called that, was buried deep in the estate's archives. Rooms of parchment, sealed jars of earth from foreign lands, bones wrapped in cloth and tied with symbols no scholar could decipher. On certain nights, when the wind came from the north, the villagers swore they could hear drums from the estate, slow and deliberate, as though marking the heartbeat of something immense and unseen. Those who heard it often woke the next day, with dreams they could not shake, dreams of standing in a hall lined with mirrors that reflected not their own faces, but strangers who stared back with unblinking eyes. In time, people stopped asking questions, stopped resisting, stopped caring. That was the family's greatest power, not the wealth, not the rituals, but the erosion of will in those who might have stood against them. By the time the next century's right approached, the entire region was bound to them in ways even they no longer understood. And still, the whispers in the taverns never fully died, only softened, waiting for the next fool who thought he could name the curse without paying. Its price! Price. The silence that wrapped around the manor was not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating weight of a grave left open under a moonless sky, and as I walked deeper into its long-forgotten corridors, the air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing, each step sinking me further into the marrow of its truth. There were no portraits here, only outlines where frames once hung, like the shadows of eyes that had been torn from the wall, refusing to watch any longer. The furniture was skeletal, stripped of comfort, as though the house itself had been preparing for its own autopsy. And beneath the dust and decay, a pulse throbbed faintly, not in the walls, but in the floor, as though something below was alive and waiting the family records. We found were incomplete pages, torn names blotted in ink so heavy it had eaten through the paper. But there were patterns, the same illnesses repeating generation after generation, the same sudden disappearances, the same whispered scandals and all, of them never fully investigated, as if the law itself had been taught to avert its gaze. The deeper I dug, the more I understood that this dynasty's power was not inherited in the way the world thinks it was not land or wealth or titles that passed from one to the next. It was a pact. Something forged so long ago, its original terms had been swallowed by time, but the cost remained and the payment came in flesh and memory. The oldest living member we tracked down spoke in riddles her, eyes clouded with the milky glaze of cataracts, but her voice steady. She said the blood remembers even when the mind tries to forget. She would not say what that meant, but she held my wrist with a grip so cold it was almost wet, and told me not to look for the root, because it was not in the soil. The more I thought on her words, the more I realized she was not speaking metaphorically. The root was not buried in earth, but in people in a lineage, knotted like a vine choking its own trunk. The rumors said that long before the country was born, this family's ancestor was part of something not recorded in any history. We are allowed to read a gathering that was not religious, yet not entirely human. Either they had bound themselves to a covenant that ensured survival and dominance in exchange for something they could never undo. And when I tried to trace that covenant in historical records, the trail dissolved into events that made no sense. Ships arriving with no manifest. Passengers who were never logged yet appeared in census data years later. Each generation had at least one child born with an identical mark on their body, a scar that was not a scar, more like a brand, but no tool could have made it. And even when the skin aged, the mark stayed sharp as if the body aged around it. There were stories of these marked ones dying young or being hidden away under the excuse of illness. But those who knew said they were never ill, only dangerous, not in the way of violence, but in their ability to see and to speak what others could not hear. There is a danger in speaking truths that cut through the fabric of the accepted world, and I began to suspect that these children were both the product and the curse. Of the pact, the family's public face was one of respectability, philanthropy, and grace, but in private letters that I found in a sealed drawer, their tone was desperate. The patriarch in 1842, writing to his son, spoke of keeping the watchers satisfied and making sure the blood remains unbroken. I thought watchers was a poetic term, until I stood in the west wing where the windows had been bricked up from the outside, leaving the rooms in permanent darkness, and there in the mortar between the bricks were impressions of fingers long and narrow pressed deep into the stone as though something from outside had been clawing to get in or to pull something out. The servants in the nearby town never spoke of the house after dusk, they said. The light in the highest window sometimes appeared, though no one lived in that part of the building anymore, and they spoke of the tolling sound like a bell, but not a bell resonant and wet, echoing only on nights when the wind came from the east. I began to connect the nights of the tolling to the sudden departures of certain family members, and in the courthouse records I found quiet annulments, voided wills, land sold at impossible prices to buyers whose names dissolved under scrutiny. It was as if someone or something was purchasing not the land but the people themselves, and whenever the purchase was made, the marked child of that generation vanished entirely without burial or public mourning. The most disturbing thing was how often the transactions were signed not by the head of the family, but by someone listed simply as guardian with no surname, no trace in any census, and yet their handwriting was identical across centuries, as if it had been written by the same hand. From the beginning, the more I pieced together, the more the air seemed to shift around me. My nights filled with the sensation of being studied, not watched in the human sense, but examined as if my presence was being measured against a standard. I could not perceive, and when I returned to the manor one last time, the front doors, which had been swollen shut by years of neglect, opened without resistance. The air inside was warm for the first time, and the pulse in the floor was stronger, more insistent. It drew me down to the cellar where the stone was slick with condensation, though there was no water source, and in the center was a single chair facing the wall. The chair's wood was smooth from use, but the seat was stained black, and on the wall before it, a sentence had been scratched into the stone in letters so deep my fingers could feel their edges. The blood keeps its own, and I understood then that this was not merely a warning, but a rule, and that my investigation had already bound me in ways I could not yet see. The deeper you go into the record of America's most carefully guarded bloodlines, the more you realize that the power they wield is not merely economic or political, but something woven into the marrow of their descendants, a design that repeats itself through centuries, as though a hidden hand is rewriting the same cursed script. Generation after generation, the dynasty we now arrive at was never known by its true name to the public. Their lands passed through shell companies, their faces, hidden behind charitable foundations, their official histories written by ghost authors, paid to erase the stains that would have revealed the truth. But within the sealed archives, the evidence remained a ledger of births and deaths that made no sense to anyone who believed in coincidence in these records. The firstborn of every generation died before the age of 13, always under circumstances declared tragic, yet natural drowning in a shallow pond, despite being strong swimmers falling. From a horse in broad daylight with no witnesses in the final hours before sundown, doctors spoke of weak heart seizures, fevers. Yet when their bodies were quietly examined by the one coroner in the state who could not be bought, he wrote in his private diary that their blood held strange anomalies, thickening unnaturally under light, as if resisting the sun itself. The dynasty's patriarch in the 1800s had been a figure of immense charm, and feared cunning a man who could sit with presidents, and then order the ruin of an enemy. Without a hint of malice in his voice, his children were schooled in Europe under names that did not appear on any passenger manifests. When they returned, they seemed different, harder, colder, more deliberate in Their speech yet always polite, as though politeness itself was a weapon. The whispers among servants spoke of rituals held in the old family chapel, a building locked to all outsiders for over 200 years. It was not consecrated in the way of any church, yet bore symbols no scholar could identify at its altar. No cross, no saint, only a silver basin that servants claimed was never dry. The one maid who dared to peer into it swore she saw her own reflection blink at her when she had. Not the smell of iron and salt haunted that room. Though no fire burned there, the land they owned stretched for miles over hills and valleys where no one dared to build. The old boundaries were marked by black stones with strange grooves. The few who trespassed came back sick, their skin breaking out in patterns that looked like writing when the dynasty's men married their wives, either vanished into reclusion or were found dead. Within 3 years, the explanation was always consumption, the wasting disease. But there was something about the speed of their decline that suggested more than illness. These women's eyes were described in journals as empty, long before their bodies failed. One traveler in the 1920s, a journalist looking for a scandal, stumbled upon their estate by chance. He wrote later in a private letter never meant for publication that the silence of the place was wrong, not the silence of peace, but of listening, as though the trees themselves leaned in to catch every word. He dared not stay overnight, instead leaving as dusk approached. But before he left, he saw from a distance the family gathered on the great lawn. Not speaking, not moving their heads, all turned toward the same point in the distance where no road lay. It was only later, when he checked the map, that he realized they had been looking toward an unmarked patch of woods said by locals to be the site of the original homestead burned to the ground 2 centuries prior. What no one explained was why no grass, no weed, no tree had grown there since, as if the soil itself refused life. One old caretaker told a farmhand in drunken confidence that the family's fortune began with a single night bargain, a bargain sealed not with gold, but with blood, and that each generation paid the price in the flesh of its own. The family never spoke of faith, yet they owned more religious relics than some cathedrals, though none were Christian in origin. Small idols carved from bone, etched with spirals that seemed to move when stared at 2 long coins, older than the nation itself, worn smooth from handling as though they were tokens passed hand to hand in some unending game. When the Great Depression came, they did not lose a cent, in fact. Their wealth doubled as though disaster elsewhere was somehow the fuel for their prosperity. This pattern repeated itself through wars, through plagues, through market collapses, each time they emerged more powerful, more connected, more untouchable. The pattern of firstborn deaths continued unbroken. Each funeral held behind gates guarded by men in plain suits with no insignia, the coffins never opened, the graves unmarked. Even family members claimed not to know exactly where the children lay. When one branch of the dynasty tried to sever ties moving west, changing their name, they too found the curse waiting. The eldest son of that branch fell ill after a hunting trip, his skin turning pale, almost translucent, before he died within a week. His body reportedly so light at the time of burial, it was as if the bones had hollowed. This is not simply superstition, it is a mechanism, a self-reinforcing system of fear and control. The elders of the dynasty do not fear the curse they enforce, because it is their anchor, their seal. They know that by keeping the bloodline bound to its price, they secure the rest of their unnatural fortune. They have advisors in law enforcement, in finance, in politics, men and women who do not share the blood, but share the hunger. Their names do not appear in the public rosters of boards or councils, yet their hands are on every lever of influence you can imagine. They do not kill because they are angry. They kill because the blood demands it, and, in return, it rewards them. The closer you look, the more you see that what you call coincidence is design. The same families appearing at the edges of events that shape the course of the nation, not in the spotlight, but in the shadow, just close enough To steer the wheel when necessary, they will tell you they are cursed, but that is only part of the truth. The deeper truth is that they are the curse, and America has been living in their shadow from the moment the first bargain was struck. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with a silence that pressed against the chest like an unseen hand, and in that suffocating stillness the truth began to unfurl, not as a revelation, but as something that had always been there, watching from the corner of the eye, just beyond the edge of light, waiting for someone foolish enough to turn their head. The Dynasties' history was not written in ink or chiseled into stone. It was buried in whispers, sealed in attics, locked behind false walls, and kept alive in the rituals performed when the rest of the world was asleep. You would not find their name in school books, yet their influence seeped into everything. Legislation passed in distant capitals, inexplicable rises and falls of fortunes, strange disappearances that never made the newspapers but changed the shape of entire communities. They were not merely a family, but an institution of secrecy, where bloodlines were maintained like rare vintages, and every union was calculated not for love, but for the preservation of certain traits, both seen and unseen. In public, they appeared impeccable, pillars of their towns, benefactors to charities, hosts of glittering banquets. But behind closed doors, their gatherings took on another nature entirely, lit not by chandeliers, but by firelight, marked not by polite toasts, but by chants in a language no living linguist could trace. Those who married into the bloodline spoke of subtle changes, at first in dreams, then in waking hours, an unease that grew into certainty that they were no longer alone, even when no one else was in the room. Children were raised under rules no outsider could understand. Never speak of the hour after midnight, never go to the third floor alone, never accept a gift from someone whose hands are cold, and the ones who broke these rules were never spoken of again. Yet, if you dig deep enough, if you speak to the oldest inhabitants of the towns where the family kept its estates, you'll find fragmented stories of carriages arriving without, drivers, of figures seen in windows long after the house had been locked and the occupants accounted for, of processions into the woods on nights when the moon was thin and the wind carried a low hum. Outsiders think curses are loud, dramatic things, full of flashing lights and shrieking voices. But this family's curse was quiet, patient, and deliberate. It wove itself into the choices they made, the people they trusted, the children they brought into the world. It was said the curse did not punish immediately. It waited, letting its victims forget it was there, until one day, without warning, everything they valued began to rot from the inside. In one branch of the family, it began with the livestock, animals born with eyes clouded white, moving as though something else guided them. In another, it was fire, homes reduced to ash in the dead of night with no signs of tampering. In another still, it was madness, entire generations wandering the halls of their mansions, speaking to things that weren't there. Yet no matter how much tragedy struck, the family never disbanded, never relinquished their power. If anything, they grew stronger, as though feeding off the very misfortune that should have destroyed them. The deeper you look, the more you realize the curse might not be an affliction at all. It might be a pact. The few who have left the bloodline entirely have spoken in hushed tones of meetings in underground rooms, of a symbol carved into the center of the table that seemed to pulse when the candles burned low, of decisions made not by the living but by something else that inhabited the family's oldest members, something that looked through their eyes but was not them. And those who left never truly escaped. Letters would arrive without return addresses, but with handwriting they recognized, messages that spoke of moments only the sender could have witnessed, moments that should have been impossible for anyone else to know. The curse was not confined to the family's grand estates or private vaults. It traveled with them, in their minds, in their blood, in the shadow that lingered just a second longer than it should when they turned a corner. In the archives of one forgotten county courthouse, there exists a ledger containing every property transaction the family ever made. If you trace the map of those holdings, they form not a random spread, but a deliberate pattern, one so exact it could not be coincidence, a pattern older than the nation itself. Some believe this pattern is the true key to the curse, a binding that keeps something buried, or perhaps keeps it alive. Whatever the truth, those who investigate too deeply often disappear, their names struck from records, their belongings sold off in estate sales no one remembers organizing. In every generation, one member of the family is chosen for a role never spoken aloud, yet understood by all: the keeper. This person carries the burden of the bloodline's darkest obligations, the one who must attend the unspoken gatherings, who must ensure the pact is renewed, who must stand alone in the cold hour before dawn and offer whatever is demanded. Some keepers live long, others only a few years, but all die in ways that leave the body untouched and the eyes wide open. Outsiders might think the family is a victim of superstition or coincidence, but those who have stood in their halls, who have felt the air thicken and the temperature drop without warning, know that something far older and far less forgiving has its roots in their lineage. You can feel it when you stand too close to them, an almost imperceptible vibration in the bones, like the echo of a sound you can't quite hear. And the most dangerous part is this: once you learn their name, once you speak it aloud in the right place, you are no longer just an observer. You are part of the story now, and the curse does not care if your blood matches theirs. It only cares that you looked too closely. It will wait for you, in your own home, in the pause between heartbeats, in the breath you take before opening a door you were certain would be locked. And when it finally steps forward, you will understand why the family never ran, why they never tried to break it. Because once you see what waits on the other side of that door, you might find yourself making the same choice they did. You might decide it is better to serve it than to be devoured by it. They had built their empire not on the bones of strangers, but on their own. It was a strange and grotesque kind of wealth, one that didn't draw from oil, gold, or land, but from the deliberate recycling of their own lineage's suffering, as though they believed each generation's agony could be distilled into a more potent elixir of control. The closer you looked, the more it seemed like the family wasn't cursed at all in the way the word is normally used. It was more that they had bound themselves to something ancient, and that binding came with a cost they were willing to pay, again and again, no matter how much blood it took. Outsiders thought the curse came in the form of deaths, madness, or bankruptcies, but the truth was far more disturbing. Those tragedies weren't the curse. They were the rituals, the payments, the upkeep of a hidden covenant. And the only reason the dynasty still stood was because the family understood something that almost no one else dared to. Power isn't maintained by avoiding loss. It's maintained by choosing exactly what to lose and when. But when you follow the trail far enough back into the diaries that no archivist was meant to read, into the grave markers whose inscriptions have been chiseled away, you see the pattern emerge in stark relief. Every third generation, a deliberate collapse. Every collapse, preceded by whispers in the surrounding towns of strange occurrences, births without fathers, sudden disappearances, inexplicable wealth flowing into the family's accounts right, as their public fortunes were supposed to be failing. And when you match those collapses against the missing persons records, the correlation is almost perfect. But of course, those records aren't easy to find anymore. County courthouses burned down. Floods swept through the basements where archives were kept. Clerks died suddenly with no one trained to take their place. Some would say that was coincidence or poor rural infrastructure. But you and I both know that when destruction is that selective, it isn't the hand of chance. It's the hand of someone who understands that memory is the greatest threat to a dynasty built on blood. There was one event, though, that even they couldn't fully bury. It happened in 1894, in a town that no longer exists on any official map, though the land it stood on is still very much there. Back then, it was called Grayford, a place with fewer than 500 souls, most of whom were farmers, trappers, or rail workers. The family had one of their lesser estates there, one of those properties meant to be far from the eyes of major cities, the kind of place where they could work without interference. For 3 years, townsfolk reported strange lights on the property, blue and white flashes, the kind that left an afterimage burned into your vision if you stared too long. At night, the sound of chanting would roll over the fields, not in English, and not in any language the locals recognized. The sheriff sent deputies twice, but both times they came back pale, mumbling excuses about trespassing laws and matters above their pay grade. And then, one cold morning in February, the family gathered the entire town in the square. Their patriarch at the time, a man named Ezra, addressed them directly, which in itself was unusual. People like him didn't lower themselves to public speeches. He told them that the family's Grayford estate would be sealed, effective immediately, and that no one was to set foot there under any circumstances. He claimed there had been an outbreak of a sickness, though he couldn't say what it was, only that it was of the mind. He promised to compensate the town for any trouble, and then he turned and left without taking questions. For a week, the estate stood silent. Then one night, the windows glowed again, this time with a deep red light that some swore they could see even from the far hills. The next morning, a column of smoke rose from the property, black and greasy, the kind of smoke that sticks to your clothes and doesn't wash out. By the time anyone got close enough to see, the estate was gone, burned to the ground, and the earth around it looked as though it had been turned to glass. No fire brigade came, no investigation followed, and within 2 months, Grayford itself was gone. Its people relocated, its name erased from county records, its land sold to a holding company with no listed owner. When you try to bring this up with historians, they either pretend they've never heard of it, or they get a certain look in their eyes, the look of someone who knows but wishes they didn't. That's when you realize the dynasty's reach isn't confined to their wealth or their influence. It extends into the very fabric of what can be remembered. They have the power to decide what history even is. And if you think that kind of power doesn't still exist, you're wrong. It's alive and well, thriving in the same quiet way it always has, hidden behind facades of philanthropy, real estate portfolios, and political campaigns. The curse, if you can even call it that, isn't a supernatural affliction. It's a legacy of choosing obedience to something older than the nation itself over loyalty to one's own blood. That's why they survive when others fade. That's why no matter how much is exposed, they remain untouched. But here's the part most people can't wrap their heads around. This covenant they're bound to, it doesn't just take from them. It gives. Every collapse they endure is followed by an exponential rise in their fortune and influence, as though the loss was an investment paid into some invisible account that always yields. You can see it in the ledgers, if you know where to. Look, you can trace it in the sudden deaths of rivals, in the inexplicable laws passed in their favor, in the rapid disappearance of scandals that should have ruined them. And somewhere, in the ruins of Grayford, the foundation stones of that estate are still there, buried under a century of soil, waiting for the day someone digs deep enough to uncover them. But I warn you, should you be foolish enough to try, you might find more than stones. You might find proof that the dynasty's so-called curse isn't bound to their blood alone, but to anyone who dares to pull back the veil. The further you move into the story, the less you can pretend it's coincidence, and the more you begin to see the outline of something that has been waiting all along, as if each name, each date, each death is not a random point on a timeline, but a link in a chain that has been pulled tighter for centuries. Until now, you can hear it groaning in the dark hallways of old mansions and abandoned courtrooms. You can almost hear the echoes of voices swearing oaths in a language that no one alive should still know. And yet it is spoken in these places without hesitation by people whose last names open doors. The rest of the world doesn't even know exist. The thing about dynasties is they don't just protect themselves with money. They protect themselves with rituals. And the deeper the ritual, the less it cares about morality, because morality is for the people who don't have the power to bend the rules. The families at the core of this story don't bend rules, they erase them. The record of the Talcott estate fire in 1892 still says accident, but the photographs taken by the first men on scene show burn patterns inconsistent with any natural blaze. The flames started in 4 different rooms at once, and yet no one was seen entering the house before it started. No broken windows, no forced doors. The investigators who mentioned this retired within a year. 3 of them died in what the papers politely called unfortunate mishaps. But the coroner's private notes tell a different story: skull fractures at angles, consistent with a deliberate strike, not an accident. The truth buried under polished obituaries, the surviving Talcotts didn't mourn. They moved that same week into a stone house on the edge of Brackenridge Forest, a place already whispered about for its strange lights at night. The locals said the family never moved in furniture. No wagons of belongings, no deliveries from town, just the family themselves and a few silent men who came and went without looking anyone in the eye. There were no windows on the first floor, only on the upper level, and those windows were always covered from inside. Whatever happened in that house never leaked out. But the day after the move, a child from the nearest farm vanished. Her shoes were found a mile from the Talcott gate. No footprints leading away, only the marks of something heavy dragged through the mud. The sheriff organized a search, but no trace was found. 3 months later, the girl's mother stopped speaking entirely. The preacher said she would sit for hours staring toward the Talcott house as if listening for something no one else could hear. I tell you this because when a bloodline decides it no longer answers to the rules of ordinary men, it doesn't simply commit crimes. It alters the environment around it, bending reality until even those who suspect the truth can't hold on to it without feeling it. Slip away. The Talcott patriarch Robert was known for his sharp mind, but the private letters we've seen suggest something else entirely, a conviction that his family's safety depended on honoring an ancient debt, not to a government, not to a church, but to something older. One letter written in the winter of 1894 reads, in part, it demands more than it ever has before. I cannot delay this season, the signs are clear. There will be consequences if we refuse. The recipient of this letter was a cousin in New York who died within weeks of receiving it, cause of death officially pneumonia, though the servant who tended him swore he woke one night to find the man standing at the window speaking to someone outside. Despite being on the 7th floor by the end of that year, 3 other Talcott relatives died similarly quiet deaths, each leaving behind strange symbols carved into their bed frames, symbols that match carvings found in the foundation stones of the Brackenridge house. When you see these connections, you begin to understand that the curse isn't a ghost or a hex in the way people tell it around fires. It is a contract, a binding agreement that moves through generations, altering the fates of everyone tied to it. And when someone tries to break it, the chain pulls back harder then. Before the trouble is, the chain doesn't care who breaks. First the guilty, the innocent, they are all currency. And this is what makes these dynasties so untouchable. They hide their cruelty inside something so old that anyone who uncovers it is dismissed as insane or superstitious. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Talcotts had scattered, but the same events followed them in different towns. Unexplained fires, livestock found dead without a mark on them, neighbors waking in the night to the sound of heavy knocking on their doors, only to find no one there. In 1923, a school teacher in Albany traced several of her most difficult students back to Talcott. Mothers, she wrote in her diary, that these children spoke in their sleep, often repeating the same phrases in a guttural tone she didn't recognize. She locked the diary away, but her niece found it decades later and confirmed the handwriting. The teacher herself vanished one February morning, her coat left hanging in the school cloakroom. The police searched the river, but no body surfaced. One fisherman swore he saw her weeks later walking along the shore barefoot in the snow, accompanied by a man in a long, dark coat who held her arm too tightly and did not. Look back, this pattern of disappearance, obedience, and sudden death plays out again and again across the history of these hidden dynasties. It isn't random, it is methodical, and it thrives in the shadows where truth is too unbelievable to be printed. You have to ask yourself why no one stops it, why lawmen resign, why witnesses recant. And when you do, the only answer that fits is that the reach of this bloodline and others like it extends further than we imagine into politics, business, even the church. The hand that shakes yours in public may be the same one that signs an order in private, and the order may not be for your benefit. There's a point where you realize that the curse isn't superstition. It's infrastructure built into the bones of the country you live in, and if you listen closely enough late at night, you might hear it breathing. They never told you the cost of silence, because the ones who kept the books had long since buried their own records in vaults that were never meant to be opened. The bloodlines you've been hearing about did not simply fade, they adapted. They sheathed skins like serpents, keeping the venom the same, while changing the face they presented to the world. One generation would wear the mask of respectable merchants. The next would wrap themselves in the banners of politics or philanthropy, and yet the machinery behind the curtains remained untouched, an unbroken mechanism of control, cruelty, and ritual. The older men in their ranks taught the younger ones never to leave a trace that could be followed back to the family. This was their only real commandment. But every commandment has a cost, and this one was paid in the currency of the innocent. Imagine growing up inside one of these dynasties, where every meal was eaten beneath portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you not with affection, but with accusation, where whispers of past deeds were never spoken aloud, but still weighed in the air like the scent of something rotting in the walls. The children were not raised, they were molded, pressed into shapes designed. To continue the pattern of dominance and secrecy, it was never about wealth alone. Wealth is a tool, but power is the end game, the kind of power that allows a man to bend the will of a town, a court, a nation, without ever stepping into the light. In the early winter of 1892, a boy from one such family vanished from his room without a sound, his window locked from the inside, his bed still warm. The town searched the rivers, the woods, the abandoned barns. They found nothing, and yet the family never reported him missing. No notices, no reward the next year at a gathering in their ancestral estate. A new young man appeared among them, wearing the same strange pendant the boy had worn in every childhood portrait, but older, colder his eyes, holding the same depthless emptiness, and those who had known the boy whispered to one another about how his smile was the same, yet entirely different, as if the flesh was familiar. But whatever lived behind it had been replaced. Those whispers never left the room, of course, because to speak against the family was to invite their gaze, and no one survived long once they were noticed. The rituals they performed were never written down, not even coded. Instead, they were carried in memory, in blood, in the muscle memory of hands that had done the work for generations, a work that began long before America itself existed, when these families were still bound to older houses across the ocean, houses that traced their lineage to things far older than kings or kingdoms, the kind of things that wore crowns of bone and demanded offerings in return for whispers of prophecy. Those whispers shaped the earliest foundations of this nation, not in the open halls of debate, but in shadowed rooms where decisions were sealed not with signatures, but with oaths sworn in blood. Every law, every alliance, every war they pushed or halted was part of a longer design, one that served a master the public would never know to exist. And yet if you walk through certain towns, you can still feel it, not in the obvious ways, but in the subtle. The way a street will bend unnaturally to lead to a certain building. The way certain windows are always dark. though the building is occupied, the way the oldest families never intermarry outside a certain circle, as if they were guarding something fragile but dangerous. These patterns are not coincidence. They are the skeletal structure of the dynasty itself in the archives of one forgotten library. A historian once uncovered a ledger that detailed births, marriages, and deaths across 3 centuries. But beside certain names, there were no dates of death, only symbols, strange geometric patterns inked in the margins. When he traced those names against census and property records, he found that many of those individuals had simply vanished. No graves, no probate, no sale of possessions, as if they had stepped out of time itself. Within weeks of his discovery, the library suffered a sudden electrical fire that burned the upper floors where the ledger had been stored. The historian was found days later in a hotel room across the state, his belongings missing, his body unmarked, but his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling as if he had seen something in the final moment that stopped his heart. Whatever these families were doing, it was not meant to be seen by anyone outside the bloodline, and those who came too close were dealt with swiftly and without hesitation. Even now, there are places they gather that have no modern maps, no satellite images, no recorded addresses, the old estates with cellars deeper than reason and hallways that don't match the exterior layout where candles burn without melting, and the air tastes of copper in these places. The true heirs are instructed in the art of erasure, the skill of removing someone so completely from the world that even memory refuses to hold on to them. Those who learn this well are rewarded with the power to move unseen, to speak and be obeyed, without question, and to carry the curse forward into the next century, for that is what it is, a curse not just upon the bloodline, but upon the land itself. The soil remembers every scream, every drop spilled in the name of the family's will. You can feel it when you walk it, the ground unsteady beneath you, as if something deep below is turning, shifting, restless, and waiting for the next command. And still the families endure because they understand something the rest of the world refuses. To face the most dangerous power is not the one that shouts. It is the one that whispers. And the whispers in their halls have been guiding the fate of this nation since long before you were born. The air in that forgotten corridor was heavy with a stillness that felt rehearsed, as if the walls themselves had been trained to listen and not breathe, every surface coated with a fine dust that had not settled naturally, but seemed placed there to mute the sound of footsteps, the kind of dust that only collects when no one dares disturb a place, not for decades, perhaps centuries, yet somehow the faint impression of movement lingered, the sense that whatever had once lived here still did, unseen, patient, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to step into the light, or perhaps to drag you into the dark. And it was here that the truth about the dynasty began to show itself, not in documents or in whispered rumors, but in the architecture itself, in the unnatural precision of angles, the too narrow proportions of hallways designed not for comfort, but for control, in the way certain doors seemed to lead nowhere, yet gave off an almost imperceptible draft, hinting at spaces that should not exist and perhaps should never be opened. For the family that built this estate had mastered the art of deception in brick and stone long before they mastered it in politics, trade, and blood, and each generation had added to the maze, building over rooms they could no longer bear to see, hiding wings where unspeakable acts had taken place, but never tearing them down because destruction was not their way. No, the dynasty preserved its sins like relics, sealing them away as proof of their dominion over life, death, and those trapped in between. And as I walked further down that dim hall, my hand brushing the cold wood of panels carved with strange looping patterns, I began to see that these markings were not decoration, but something older, symbols, too intricate to be random, their shapes recurring in exact sequences throughout the property. On the gate, in the stained glass, even etched into the metal fastenings of the cellar doors. And it struck me then that these were not symbols for the living, but for those the family believed still listened. They're dead, they're bound, they're cursed. And the more I studied them, the more I felt as if I was trespassing not on private property, but on a private covenant, a pact that had not been broken for generations, perhaps since the very founding of this nation. For the dynasty's origins predated the country itself, their first patriarch arriving on these shores not as a refugee or an opportunist, but as a man already steeped in power, already carrying a charter signed by hands older than any colonial governors, a charter that promised him land, influence, and immunity, but in return demanded something he did not speak of openly, something his bloodline would repay in installments with interest extracted from the most human of currencies: children, heirs, and blood. And that was why every record of their beginnings had been doctored, dates blurred, names misspelled intentionally, photographs misfiled or destroyed, because the truth was that the first 10 years of their time in America had been spent not building farms or towns, but digging, tunneling, burrowing into the ground, as if they were searching for something or preparing to hide something they feared others might find. And when they finally emerged, they had not built a manor in the style of the time, but a fortress disguised as one, complete with rooms designed to keep people in rather than out, corridors that narrowed to trap anyone unfamiliar with the layout, and a central hall built not for gatherings but for rituals, its ceiling an exact mirror of the constellations, on a specific date that no astronomer had been able to match to any recorded night sky, suggesting that the family's sense of history did not begin with our calendars. And as the decades passed and their wealth multiplied through ventures both public and hidden, the whispers about them grew more grotesque. Stories of children, seen playing in the gardens one summer who never appeared again. Of servants who entered the family's employ only to vanish without so much as a resignation. Of a guest who stumbled upon a locked door in the east wing and came back pale, trembling, unable to speak, dying weeks later under circumstances so strange that even the local doctor refused to sign the death certificate. And every time someone asked about these events, the family had an answer ready, polite, plausible, and utterly hollow, the kind of explanation that collapses the moment you apply weight to it. Yet no one pressed further, because pressing meant inviting their attention, and once you had their attention, you belonged to them in ways you could not undo, for they were not merely rich or influential. They were custodians of something older and darker than any ledger or legal title, something passed down in blood, and that blood was the true source of their authority. For unlike most dynasties whose lineages were fragile, theirs was unnaturally stable, generation after generation producing heirs who looked not just similar but almost identical to their predecessors, as if the family tree had been pruned of any genetic divergence, a fact that some dismissed as coincidence, others as selective breeding, but the truth was far worse, for hidden in one of the estate's subcellars, in a vault no wider than a coffin and twice as deep, I saw something I will never unsee. A row of jars, each filled with a dark, viscous fluid in which floated a perfectly preserved organ, each labeled with a name and a date, the names matching those of the dynasty's ancestors, the dates marking not their birth or death, but something else, something the family tracked with meticulous precision, and it was then I understood that this was not mere superstition, but an ongoing practice, that every time a member of the bloodline died, the family did not bury all of them, and that part of them was kept here, sustained, not for remembrance, but for use. And if that sounds grotesque, it is only because you have not yet grasped the scale of what they were preserving. For these jars were not relics of the past, but reserves for the future, pieces of the family's essence stored to be reintroduced when needed, ensuring that the bloodline never thinned, never weakened, never allowed chance to interfere with its design, and it made me realize that perhaps the curse did not lie in the misfortunes that befell them, but in the unnatural way they had insulated themselves from the natural order. For when you cheat death, you do not escape its cost. You simply defer it, and the debt grows heavier, darker, hungrier, until one day it comes to collect not just from you, but from everyone in your orbit. And as I turned to leave that vault, I felt that cost in the air, a heaviness that followed me back up the winding stairs, into the long, unlit corridor, and out toward the cold night. But even outside the house, under the open sky, the feeling did not leave, because once you know the truth of their blood, you begin to see it everywhere, in the faces of their descendants walking the streets as if they were ordinary, in the way their eyes hold too long on strangers, in the subtle, predatory patience of their speech, and you understand that their dynasty is not bound by walls or land. It moves through us, among us, and beneath us, waiting for the moment when it will need to reclaim what it believes was never truly ours to begin with. The deeper we dig, the less the earth feels like soil, and the more it feels like an old wound that refuses to heal, as if the ground itself remembers what was done and resists the touch of human hands. And in the chronicles of these hidden dynasties, it becomes clearer with every layer we peel away that their wealth was never built on the sweat of honest labor or the ingenuity of honest minds, but on the ritualized breaking of human will, the calculated extraction of spirit, until nothing was left but compliant flesh, an inherited strategy passed from one generation to the next, like a treasured relic. Each heir taught not only how to preserve the family fortune, but how to keep the bloodline itself bound to its darker pacts. And here lies the truth most cannot bear to confront, that their curse was not an accident of fate, but a deliberate covenant made in secrecy, signed not with ink, but with something warmer and far more permanent. A pact that made every descendant both an inheritor and a prisoner, compelled to guard secrets that would burn the entire family tree to ash if ever they saw daylight. And you can almost hear the laughter of the first patriarch echoing down the centuries, a laughter without mirth, the sound of someone who knew he had traded his humanity for a form of power the world would not understand until it was too late. For the records of their transactions, the ledgers and property deeds, were only the shallow crust of their empire. Beneath it lay the real currency, people, their lives, their futures, and their silence, all tallied with the same cold precision one might use to count coins, and so the public saw their grand estates, their donations to churches, their sponsorship of civic monuments, never suspecting that every gesture of benevolence was merely a cover, a carefully crafted stage set to distract from the machinery grinding away in the shadows. And when whispers did arise, when rumors of disappearances or strange gatherings threatened to drift into polite conversation, they were smothered with the same efficiency as a candle's flame between two fingers, extinguished before they could cast light into the corners of the dynasty's history. Yet every suppressed story leaves residue, and in the case of this family, that residue clung to the air around them, giving their gatherings an unshakable tension, as if every guest understood they were standing in a place where too much had been done in silence, where the walls themselves felt complicit, and the servants, always careful with their eyes and voices, moved as though the weight of invisible chains dragged at their ankles, a posture learned not from instruction but from long observation of what happened to those who forgot their place, and still the family persisted, decade after decade, century after century, adapting to each new age with the same ruthless efficiency. For curses of this nature are not broken by time alone. They grow more intricate, more deeply woven into the fabric of the family, until even the children are born with the sense that their lives are not entirely their own, that there is a script written for them long before they take their first breath. And the cost of deviating from it is not merely financial ruin or social exile, but something far more personal, the kind of retribution that cannot be described without sounding like superstition, yet leaves scars that are real enough to touch. And so the heirs played their parts, smiling for photographs, attending the right schools, marrying the right people, all while their nights were haunted by dreams they dared not share. Dreams in which the faces of long-dead ancestors appeared at the foot of their beds, not as gentle protectors, but as wardens ensuring the prisoner did not escape. And this is where the true genius of the dynasty's curse becomes apparent, for it required no external enforcement, no threats shouted in anger. The fear was cultivated so thoroughly within the bloodline that the children learned to police themselves, to sabotage their own attempts at freedom, believing it was their own weakness rather than an inherited shackle that held them in place. And in this way, the dynasty ensured its survival through every upheaval the nation endured. Wars, depressions, political revolutions, emerging from each crisis not weakened, but stronger, richer, more deeply entrenched in the corridors of power. While the public marveled at their resilience without ever asking the only question that mattered, resilience against what? For you cannot admire the strength of a parasite without acknowledging the body it feeds upon, and here, that body was not the nation as a whole, but the very lineage they claimed to protect, drained generation after generation to keep the patriarch's original bargain intact. And the most disturbing truth of all is that some heirs, upon finally grasping the nature of their inheritance, embraced it, not with the reluctant resignation of those who cannot escape, but with the hungry ambition of those who see in it an opportunity to rise beyond ordinary human limits. And so the curse transformed from a chain into a crown, worn proudly, even flaunted in certain coded ways to those in their inner circle. And the family's rituals, once performed in secrecy out of necessity, became a tradition, a heritage to be celebrated in private gatherings where the newest generation was inducted not with gentle guidance, but with the kind of ordeal that leaves a permanent mark on the soul, ensuring that even if they fled, even if they changed their name and tried to disappear into the anonymity of the wider world, the sense of belonging to something darker and greater would follow them like a shadow that could not be outrun. And thus the dynasty moved forward into the present, its wealth unchallenged, its influence so subtle it was invisible, and its curse as potent as the day it was forged, a silent thread binding every living descendant to a history they could never truly escape, no matter how far they traveled or how loudly they denied it, because the moment they closed their eyes in the dark, the laughter of the patriarch would return, low and knowing, reminding them that they were his, and always would be. The farther you descend into the archives of this country, the more you begin to understand that America's history was never written in ink, but in the blood of those who dared to inherit a name they did not choose, and within the sealed vaults of certain state buildings there are records so heavily restricted that even governors have been denied entry, and among those forbidden files lies the lineage of the Marston family, a dynasty that did not appear on census rolls until 1812, yet somehow owned vast acres of land long before any official deed was recorded, land that seemed to yield no crops for others but fattened their coffers year after year, as if the earth, itself bent to their bloodline, and the first whispers I uncovered about them came not from historians, but from undertakers, men who swore that every Marston burial was accompanied by a strange metallic scent in the air. Not like blood exactly, but like iron heated just before forging, a smell that lingered on their clothes for days, and if you track their ancestry, you'll find that no branch of their family tree ever split naturally. Every marriage was either between cousins or arranged with women whose origins were obscured by fabricated birth records, as if they were engineering something, refining their own strain of humanity across generations. And what they refined was not beauty nor intellect alone, but a kind of unnatural resilience, a body that aged slower than normal, a mind that bent people's will with alarming ease. And you might think I'm describing some romanticized legend, but I've seen the photographs locked away in the county's condemned courthouse. The ones showing children born decades apart yet bearing faces so identical they could have been twins. Children who were never seen beyond the Marston land, whose existence was denied to tax collectors and census takers. And then there's the matter of the storms, because whenever a Marston was born or died, the sky over their estate blackened without forecast, lightning splitting trees without rain to follow, and locals swore that if you stood near their fence line during those storms, you could hear low chanting in a language no one recognized, a rhythm that matched the pulse in your own chest, pulling you forward until you realized your feet were crossing onto their soil without permission. And I have read the testimonies from men who tried to work that land as hired hands and quit after a single week, not because of mistreatment, but because of the dreams. Dreams in which a tall figure stood at the foot of their bed whispering numbers, dates and names they didn't know, only to find those same names carved faintly into the barn beams the next morning, carved decades before they were born. And you must understand, this family's wealth was never about gold or oil or industry. It was about leverage, about knowing things no one else should. And when railroads were being planned, somehow they always knew which parcels of land to acquire months before the routes were announced. When wars loomed, they divested from certain markets just days before crashes, and when asked, they claimed it was intuition, but intuition does not explain a handwritten letter from 1849 detailing the exact stock market collapse of 1929 in chilling accuracy. A letter kept in a locked drawer alongside a series of birth records for children not yet conceived, and perhaps the most damning thing is the pattern of disappearance. Farm hands, governesses, even passing salesmen who stayed overnight and were never seen again, their names remembered only because someone filed missing person reports that went cold within weeks. And though the sheriff's deputies swore there was no evidence linking the Marstons to these vanishings, a ledger in their private library listed initials and dates that matched each missing person to the day, and the final column in that ledger bore a mark that looked less like ink and more like something scorched into the page. A symbol I have only ever seen repeated on a rusted gate deep in the woods behind their land, a gate that leads to a stone stairway spiraling down into the earth, a place I once entered for precisely 3 minutes before the air turned thick enough to choke me and the sound of rushing water filled my ears, though there was none to be found. And I will tell you this: there are dynasties built on money, dynasties built on war, but the Marstons built theirs on something far older, something that bends the natural order until history itself forgets to erase them. And you may wonder why such a family has not been exposed, why journalists haven't destroyed them. But the answer is simple. Every man who has tried has either vanished, lost his mind, or been discredited in ways so absolute his own family stopped believing him. And I cannot shake the sense that the Marstons are not merely surviving but waiting, as if each generation is nothing more than a caretaker for some culmination yet to come. A convergence when all their engineered traits, all their preserved secrets, all their stolen knowledge will be unleashed in one heir who will not hide in the hills but step into the open. And when that day comes, the blood that has cursed their name will become the weapon that cements it forever.